Hey, ladies and gentlemen, we're getting close to the AP exam, and I just finished reading your argumentative essays. I've got a couple things I would like to say to the group that maybe weren't clear in the comments that I left you on your rubric, or were just some ideas that seem to be common problems that we need to clear up. So, first off, before I get started, please make sure that you've received your email from AP College Board and you've done your checks as far as browser checks and all those kinds of things. In the next day or so, I'll see if I can't help us a little bit with that by maybe seeing if there's anything I can do to just make sure that we're all ready to go technology-wise. Again, make sure that if you have an issue, that you get a hold of myself or Ms. Terzo so that we can solve that issue. If you've got technology problems, maybe we can arrange for something. So please make sure that you do that. The test is coming up. We need to make sure everything's ready, and we need to know well enough in advance of any problems to make sure we can fix those problems. Okay, now to the subject at hand. You had yourself an essay that you had to do, and in this case it was on free speech zones. Gave a little description of what free speech zones are for those of you who don't know. This is going to be very typical. It's going to give you an explanation of some issue. You maybe know about it, maybe you don't, but they'll give you the information that you need in order to answer the question. And then you have an actual instruction here to develop an argument either for or against the use of free speech zones on public college campuses. Okay, so again, it doesn't matter if you're for or against. This is not trying to indoctrinate anybody into one particular way of thinking. It's more just seeing, do you understand the constitutional arguments one way or another of this controversial topic? And that leads me to my first thing that I need to make sure people understand about this question. This is not a polemic. What I mean by that, for those who don't know that phrase, this is not a persuasive essay that's meant to try to inspire people to action. I read one or two essays where basically they were excellent essays that someone might scream from the steps of the courthouse at a protesting crowd trying to get them fired up. While that is excellent writing and maybe you even have decent arguments in it, that's not what we're after here. We're after something that is much more like what the lawyer inside that courthouse might be saying to a judge about why this is or is not constitutional. So again, please make sure that you're thinking more like lawyer, less like protester, and let's go forward. All right, so back to the prompt. So we have to develop an argument either for or against these free speech zones. We have to make sure in order to get full credit that we use at least one of these two essential documents. Okay, that one's pretty easy in my mind, especially First Amendment stuff. It seems to be easy since that's what we're talking about, free speech. It seems very logical and easy to think about. All right, and then we need to come up with another piece of information, another piece of evidence, and that can be another foundational document, or it could be just simply something that you know from your knowledge of course concepts, which could be some descriptions of some basic ideas from various court cases or something like that. It doesn't have to be court cases. Almost everybody in the essays that I read did pick some court cases, but it doesn't have to be. It could be just some basic, concepts. All right, you must explain your reasoning for your evidence, and of course, you also must provide an alternative piece of, an alternative position, and then handle that alternative position. So, to go to the rubric, here we go. We need a thesis. That's 1 point. Okay, it's got to both make a claim: is a free speech zone constitutional or not? And it must establish a line of reasoning. And that's actually my reason for making this video, is I want to talk about that in a second. All right, 2, we must provide evidence. You do have 1 point of evidence available to you just by having something relevant. You have to have one. You get another piece of point if you have one piece of evidence that supports your thesis. One more time, you must have a good thesis to get a point for supporting that thesis. That thesis is the vital piece. And then 3, you must have 3 points for 2 pieces of evidence, one of which must be one of those documents, and the other one can be any other kind of source that you think of. All right, Reasoning, you just simply have to show how the reasoning, how that document that you chose, that piece of evidence, relates to your thesis. This is where I want you to note, please do not assume anything. I realize it seems weird to say, hey, free speech is in the First Amendment and the First Amendment says that you have free speech. But, hey, that's the game. Don't assume. Just make sure that you state this is what the evidence is and this is how it relates to your thesis. And then finally, you must respond to an alternative perspective. You must refute, rebut, or concede. And the biggest problem I want you to make sure you overcome is that you need to make sure that it is responding to your thesis, not to something else. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second. Okay? All right. So, for the most part, everybody did pretty well. I was, pretty happy with your evidence. My concern is with the theses. All right. So, here's what College Board gave me as some thesis examples. And yes, I'm going to suggest that, hey, this is what the College Board said. Here's their example. Therefore, you should get credit for this. But let me just say that I don't like these. I don't like them because I don't know that every reader is going to see these and say, hey, that's a good roadmap. So let's look at a couple of these. It says there should not be free speech zones because this can lead to limitations of free speech being imposed in other areas. So there's your claim. There should not be a free speech zone. Okay, claim. And here's your because clause that I told you to write. Limitations could be imposed in other areas. Now that provides a roadmap, I guess. You've got a claim and you're going to talk about limitations. Okay, fine. Free speech zones should be permitted because these zones place reasonable time, place, manner restrictions on First Amendment rights. I like this one better because here free speech zones should be permitted. There's your claim. First piece of evidence is going to be about reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. Second piece of evidence on First Amendment rights. And this gives me an example of what I would rather see you do. You have two pieces of evidence that you're going to try to use to explain in your essay. And notice in this second thesis, you have two pieces of evidence that are mentioned. You have an evidence paragraph that's going to be on time, place, and manner restrictions, and you have an evidence paragraph that's going to be on the First Amendment, your essential document. So this is the kind of thesis I would like to see you write. And while this thesis, where you just simply gives this kind of basic concept of, hey, I'm going to be talking about limitations, is apparently acceptable by College Board in that they gave you an evidence here, I don't like it. I'm worried about it. I just don't think it's as solid as this one that actually states what kinds of pieces of evidence you're going to be talking about. So let me give you a couple examples that I wrote. Okay. So make this larger for you. All right. So here's the examples that I came up with. So number one, the yellow is my claim. The blue is where I mentioned the evidence that I'm going to be using in later paragraphs. So here's an argument in favor of free speech zones. Free speech zones are constitutional and appropriate. There's my claim, okay? Because they protect students' First Amendment speech rights. Okay, so my first piece of evidence is going to be an explanation of the First Amendment. It's one of the essential documents covered on college campuses while also limiting conflicts due to offensive speech that might be viewed as fighting words. All right, so there's where I've introduced my second piece of evidence that we are going to allow free speech zones in order to avoid conflicts, and this is something that we have been permitted to do thanks to the concept of fighting words as given in Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire. You could even talk about clear and present danger in Schenck versus U.S. All right, so in other words, I have introduced both a claim and two concepts that I will use in my 2 paragraphs about this topic. This is a claim and a roadmap. Claim, constitutional appropriate. Roadmap. First, I'm going to talk about First Amendment rights. Second, I'm going to talk about limiting those rights due to fighting words. Another one. Free speech zones are constitutional and appropriate. Claim. Because they are an appropriate balance between protecting students' First Amendment right to speech and protest, first paragraph, while protecting public safety through application of time, place, manner restrictions. Obviously, I got that from the College Board example. I just like this better because 1, claim, 2, piece of evidence, 3, piece of evidence, roadmap. I'm going to first talk about a paragraph about speech and protest in the First Amendment, and then second I'm going to have a paragraph discussing time, place, manner restrictions. Maybe I'll use Westboro Baptist Church or other examples as restrictions being supported by the Supreme Court. Okay, give you a negative example, a con. Free speech zones are unconstitutional restrictions on a student's First Amendment rights to speech and protest. So first paragraph, there's my claim, unconstitutional. First paragraph, First Amendment right to speech and protest, I'm going to talk about it. Second, these rights have been extended by case law to include public schools and places, meaning, hey, you have free speech in those areas. I'm going to use Tinker versus Des Moines to prove that's the case, and so therefore I have 1 piece, 2 pieces of evidence, and I gave the roadmap. First, I'm going to talk about free speech. Second, I'm going to talk about whether or not free speech is in public schools. Okay, a couple things, just one more thing to talk about before I move into the last point. Something to be careful of. A lot of you use Cohen versus California to support speech, saying it was avoidable. But actually, if you think about it, Cohen, California would be an argument to use against free speech zones, because if it's avoidable, then you can avoid it, and we don't need a special zone for you to have speech in. So just be very careful with the evidence you use, that you make sure it actually is supporting the idea you're trying to say. Okay, last point. So a lot of you had some issues with the alternative perspective, and I don't want to embarrass anybody, but I want to use this as an example. Okay, alternative perspective needs to refer directly to your thesis. So in this case, if your thesis is about a free speech zone, which everybody should be, then in the alternative perspective, your alternative perspective also needs to be about free speech zones. And in this case, we have a really good argument about free speech itself, but not about free speech zones. While free speech shouldn't be restricted in certain zones, it should have some restrictions that are established by Chaplinsky and New Hampshire. Very good explanation about the limitations on speech. But unfortunately, limitations referring to speech itself, not to the concept of free speech zones specifically. So even though the student tried to bring it back around with this is the case, and why one of the reasons why you shouldn't be restricted to a free speech zone, the argument is actually about restrictions on speech in general, and therefore not about the topic, therefore not about the thesis in free speech zones. All right, I am going to post some other things, probably this time maybe just a simple thesis writing exercise, something that doesn't quite take me so long to grade, and we can just get some practice. Remember, if you don't get the thesis, you don't get any points. I had a number of people who wrote really good essays that I'm worried about, because while I like the essay, if you don't get that thesis, you only get 1 point, because you get this evidence point. You didn't get your thesis point. You didn't get this point, because it refers to your thesis. And you can't get these 2 points because they also must refer to your thesis. So your thesis is the most important part. So next assignment is going to be specifically write a thesis. All right, that's it for now. If you have any questions, please make sure you get a hold of me, and we will talk about then. Good luck, and see you later.